She was 22 years old, and the only thing she owned in the world was a hammer. Not a fortune, not a deed, not even a horse to carry her away from the town that had decided, in the way small towns sometimes do, that she no longer belonged in it. Just a hammer, iron-headed, hickory-handled, worn smooth on the grip from 30 years of use before it ever found her hands. Old Virgil Moss had pressed it into her palm the winter before he died, and he'd said, "A good tool remembers every nail it's ever driven. Don't you forget that." She hadn't. She carried it wrapped in a piece of burlap, tucked under her arm, as she walked out of Harlan Grist's mercantile for the last time. We want to tell you about a young woman named Willa Crane. We want to tell you what happened to her in the spring of 1904, in a town called Sutter's Hollow, in the hill country of eastern Tennessee. Because what happened to her is the kind of thing that makes you believe, even on your worst days, that the world has a way of balancing its own ledger. But first, you need to understand what she was walking away from. Willa's father had died when she was 9. Her mother 2 years after that. She'd been taken in by her mother's cousin, a man named Harlan Grist, who ran the only dry goods store in Sutter's Hollow, and kept his accounts with the precision of a man who believed every kindness was a transaction. He fed her. He gave her a cot in the back room behind the flour sacks. And for 12 years she worked the counter, swept the floors, tallied the inventory, and repaired whatever needed repairing, which, in a building as old as Harlan's mercantile, was always something. A broken hinge, a split shelf, a counter edge that caught on customers' sleeves. It was Virgil Moss who taught her carpentry. He was the town's woodworker, a quiet man in his 70s who smelled of pine resin and pipe smoke, and he'd taken notice of the way she fixed things. Not just making them functional, but making them right, level, plumb, clean. He let her apprentice in his workshop on Sunday afternoons, and over 7 years, she learned more from Virgil than from any other person on earth. When Virgil died, he left his tools to her, not the workshop that went to his nephew in Knoxville, who sold it within a month, but the tools themselves. The chisels, the planes, the squares, and the hammer. Harlan Grist had watched the inheritance arrive with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. 2 weeks later, he called her into his office. "You're costing me more than you're earning," he said, without looking up from his ledger. "I've kept you on out of family obligation, but obligation has its limits." She was 22. She had no money, no family, no home that was legally hers. She had a set of woodworking tools, a burlap sack with 2 dresses, and a spare pair of boots, and $7 she'd saved over 3 years by mending neighbors' furniture on her own time. She took her things and she left. The road out of Sutter's Hollow ran east through a narrow valley, and at the end of that valley was a rail depot called Caldwell Junction. It wasn't much, a platform, a water tower, a shed where the station master kept his records. But twice a week, a train came through heading south toward the bigger towns. Willa sat on a bench at Caldwell Junction with her burlap sack and Virgil's tools and waited for the afternoon train. She didn't know exactly where she was going. South, she thought. Somewhere with work, somewhere that didn't already know her name and had decided what it meant. The train arrived at 2:30. It also arrived with something else. There was a man at the depot that afternoon, a county land agent named Frederick Boyle, round-faced and perspiring even in the mild April air. He was overseeing the unloading of some crates from the freight car, and beside the freight car, half hidden in the weeds beside the track, sat something that had clearly been there for a very long time. It was a small storage car, not a passenger car, not a full freight car, something smaller, older, the kind of auxiliary car that logging outfits and mining operations sometimes used to transport equipment. Its wood planking had gone silver gray with age, and the iron fittings along the roofline had rusted the color of old blood. The door was sealed with a padlock the size of a man's fist, and around that padlock, someone had wound a length of heavy chain that had itself rusted into a single rigid thing, more sculpture now than security. Willa set down her sack and looked at it. "What's that?" she asked the station agent, a thin man named Corbett, who had the look of someone who'd answered this question before. "Comes with the depot," Corbett said. "Has since before my time. Old Shiloh Timber Company used it for storing equipment payroll. This used to be a logging spur before the main line came through. Company went under. Oh, must be 88 or so. Left the car behind. Nobody's opened it since." "Why not?" Corbett shrugged. "Nobody owns it. Nobody's owned it in 16 years. County's been trying to clear the property. Boyle over there is supposed to be handling the disposition." She looked at the land agent. Frederick Boyle, catching her gaze, walked over with the resigned air of a man who'd been interrupted. "You want it," he said before she could speak. Because I've been authorized to sell off any unclaimed assets on this parcel before the county takes possession next month. That car's a liability. It's sitting on rail right-of-way we need clear. How much? He looked at the car. He looked at her. He looked at the rusty chain and the padlock and the 16 years of accumulated neglect. $9, he said. Clear title. She had 7, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the car again. Then he pulled out a receipt book and wrote 9, crossed it out and wrote 7. Deal, he said. Though I'll tell you plain, young lady, you've bought yourself a puzzle you may never solve. Nobody's got the key. Nobody knows what's inside. It could be equipment. It could be empty. It could be full of 16-year-old rats. Willa signed the receipt. She handed over every dollar she had in the world. She watched the afternoon train leave without her. Now, we know what you're thinking. $7, everything she had. And we want you to sit with that for a moment, because that is not a small thing. That is the entirety of 3 years of Sunday afternoons, of mending chairs and fixing gates and rehanging doors for neighbors who paid in coins because cash was scarce. $7 was not an impulse, it was everything. She stood there with her receipt and her tools and no money and no ticket and looked at the car. Then she opened her burlap sack and unwrapped Virgil's hammer. The padlock itself was beyond her. Cast iron, heavy, built to last, but the chain had been welded to a bracket, bolted into the doorframe, and 16 years of rust had done its own particular work on the bolts. She studied them for a long time the way Virgil had taught her to study a problem before she picked up a tool. Look first, touch after, strike last. The brackets were original iron, probably 1880s manufacture, bolted into wood that was old-growth timber. Dense and hard, but the wood around the bolt holes had swollen and dried, and swollen again through 16 winters, and the seals were compromised. She could see the cracks. She didn't try to pick the lock. She didn't try to cut the chain. She went to work on the wood. Corbett, the station agent, came out twice to watch her. Frederick Boyle had gone home. The afternoon light moved across the depot platform and turned orange and then red, and Willa worked with methodical patience, removing the bracket rather than the lock, coaxing each rusted bolt with careful, measured strikes. Virgil had told her once that the difference between a craftsman and a brute was whether they listened to the material. Wood talks, he'd said. Iron talks. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. By the time the light failed, she had the door open. She borrowed a lantern from Corbett. She stepped inside. The car was perhaps 20 feet long. Along both walls, wooden shelving had been built into the frame, and on those shelves sat wooden crates, each stenciled with the Shiloh Timber Company mark, a pine tree inside a circle. Most were sealed with nailed lids. A few had been left open, and she could see tools inside. Drill bits, a set of draw knives, some leather harness pieces gone stiff and cracked with age. And then she saw the desk. It was bolted to the far wall. A simple writing surface with a single deep drawer, the kind of portable field desk that company foremen used. The drawer was also locked, with a smaller lock, the kind that a letter opener could have dealt with. But she didn't use a letter opener. She used one of Virgil's chisels. Inside the drawer, there were 3 things. The first was a logbook. Red cloth cover, swollen with moisture but intact, the Shiloh Timber Company letterhead embossed on the front. She opened it and began to read, and within 3 pages, she understood that the car had not merely been abandoned. It had been hidden. The logbook was the payroll record for the Shiloh Timber Company's Caldwell Junction operations, running from 1886 to 1888. And what it recorded was this. For the final 14 months of those operations, the company foreman, a man named Garland Pruitt, had been recording wages paid to workers that had not in fact been paid. The entries were meticulous. Dates, names, amounts. 23 men listed by name, their weekly wages recorded as disbursed. And in the margin of the final entry, in a different hand, smaller, more urgent, 3 words, he kept it. The second thing in the drawer was a canvas envelope, sealed with wax. Inside, she found $2,200 in company scrip, not cash, but timber company currency, the kind that had been accepted at company stores across the region during the logging boom. Scrip that had been issued against the company's assets and, if the company had assets remaining when it dissolved, could be redeemed. The third thing was a letter. It was addressed to no one in particular. It was written in the same small, urgent hand as the marginal note. If you find this, my name is Arthur Cade. I was the company clerk at Caldwell Junction from 1885 to 1888. In the winter of 1887, I discovered that Foreman Pruitt had been collecting wages from the company accounts and not distributing them to the men. He told the men there were delays. He told the company the men had been paid. I confronted him. He told me that if I reported what I'd found, he would see to it that I was charged with the theft instead. I could not prove it then. I have gathered what proof I could. The logbook records what he said was paid. The scrip represents what I believe was withheld. I recovered it from the company safe the night before the closure, before Pruett could remove it. I have hidden it here because I did not know what else to do. I am leaving Caldwell Junction. I do not know if I will survive the winter. I have been ill. But if this is found, if anyone who reads this can reach the families of these men, please, they are owed. Their children are owed. This was their work. Acade, December 1888. Willa stood in the lantern light inside the car and read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the floor of the car, among the dusty crates and the 16-year-old silence, and she cried. Not because she was sad, or not only that, but because she understood something about Arthur Cade in that moment that felt very close to home. A person who knew the truth, couldn't prove it, and chose to preserve the evidence anyway, on faith that someday someone would find it and do what needed doing. She thought about Virgil's hammer. A good tool remembers every nail it's ever driven. The company scrip presented a problem. Shiloh Timber had dissolved in 1889, and its parent holding company, a firm called Allegheny Forestry Partners, had gone through a bankruptcy proceeding in 1891. Willa didn't know any of this. What she knew was that she had a ledger, a letter, 23 names, and $2,200 in paper currency that might or might not be worth anything. She needed help. Corbett, the station agent, let her sleep in the depot shed that first night, partly out of pity and partly, she suspected, out of curiosity. In the morning, he told her that the nearest town with a lawyer was Whitfield, 12 miles east. She walked. The lawyer's name was Thomas Aldrich, and he was not what she expected. He was young, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and a small office above, hardware store. And when she laid the logbook and the letter on his desk, he read them with the expression of a man watching something unfold that he wished he'd been there to see from the beginning. The scrip, he said carefully, is an interesting question. Allegheny Forestry went through bankruptcy in '91, but there were assets, timberland holdings, that were auctioned to a reorganized company. If that reorganized company can be argued to have assumed Allegheny's liabilities. He trailed off, doing something with his pen that she recognized as thinking. There may be a legal basis for redemption. What about the men, she said. The 23 names. Some of them may still be alive. Their families may be traceable. He looked at her steadily. This is going to take time and effort. Are you prepared for that? She didn't have time. She didn't have money. She didn't have anywhere to be. Yes, she said. What followed was 6 months that we could spend an hour describing, and perhaps someday we will, in more detail than we have time for today. But here is what matters. Thomas Aldrich took the case without a retainer, on the basis that if the scrip could be redeemed, his fee would come from the recovery. He was, as it turned out, exactly the kind of lawyer who became one because he liked solving problems that other people had given up on. Willa, in the meantime, needed to eat. She set up a temporary workshop in the shed behind the Caldwell Junction depot. Corbett was amenable, and the storage car gave her more covered space than she'd had. She began doing what she knew how to do, repairs. Word traveled the way it does in small places, along fence lines and over back fences. The woman at the depot with the woodworking tools. She fixed Mrs. Hewson's kitchen cabinet in 2 hours and charged 50 cents. She repaired a split yoke for a farmer named Darby, and he paid her in a side of salt pork. She rebuilt a porch railing for the Wilton family, and they gave her a room in their house for 3 weeks. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. What was different now was that no one was keeping the money for her upkeep. What she earned was hers. By autumn, Thomas Aldrich had located 16 of the 23 men from the logbook, or their surviving family members. 7 of the men had died in the intervening years. Of those, 4 had wives or children still living in the county. The scrip redemption was more complicated, but not impossible. The reorganized timber company, now operating as Caudell Lumber, based in Knoxville, had indeed assumed certain predecessor liabilities as part of its charter agreement. Aldrich presented the logbook as evidence of an unresolved wage claim. Caudell's lawyers initially resisted. Then Aldrich presented the letter from Arthur Cade. There was a negotiation. There were letters. There was a meeting in a room in Knoxville that Willa was not invited to attend, but which Thomas Aldrich reported back to her in full, sitting across her workbench in the depot shed, with his collar loosened and his jacket over a sawhorse. They've agreed to redeem 60 cents on the dollar, he said. That's $1,320 in cash, minus my fee, which I'm setting at $150. That left 1 to 170, divided among 20 surviving claimants, the 16 men still living and the 4 widows, children of the deceased. It worked out to just under $60 per person. $60. In 1904, that was 3 or 4 months of wages for a working man. The distributions took place over 2 weeks in November, in the front room of the Whitfield County Courthouse. Thomas Aldrich handled the paperwork. Willa sat in the back of the room and watched. She watched a man named Otto Reese, who had been 24 years old when Garland Pruitt stole his wages, and was now 40 in the face but older in the eyes, receive an envelope and sit very still for a long moment before he looked up. She watched a woman named Pearl Haskins, whose husband Webb had died in 1897, never knowing the money he'd been owed, had been sitting in a locked car 7 miles from his home, sign her name in the county ledger with a careful, deliberate hand. She watched a young man, couldn't have been more than 19, come in with his mother, and she overheard him say to the clerk, "My grandfather's name was Walter Dent. He worked for Shiloh Timber." And she watched the clerk find the entry and confirm it, and watched the young man's expression do something complicated and private. She didn't speak to most of them. She didn't think it was her place. She was not the hero of their story. She was just the person who'd found the door. But Pearl Haskins found her in the hallway on the way out. "You're the one who opened that car," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Pearl looked at her for a long time. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had learned not to expect things. "Webb always said he'd been cheated," she said. "Couldn't prove it. People thought he was bitter, thought he'd spent the money and was too proud to say so." Willa didn't know what to say to that. "Thank you," Pearl said, "for not leaving it alone." By the following spring, Willa Crane had saved enough to rent a proper workspace. A small outbuilding behind the Whitfield hardware store, whose owner, a man named George Pickett, had hired her to build shelving, and then, impressed enough to become practical, offered her the outbuilding at a reduced rate in exchange for maintaining his store fixtures. She set up a proper shop. She had Virgil's tools, plus a few she'd acquired over the winter. She had a reputation in 2 counties now. Not because she'd opened the car, most people didn't know about that, but because she did good work, and charged fairly, and showed up when she said she would. Thomas Aldrich referred her a commission. A family in the county that needed furniture built for a new house. She spent 3 months on it. It was the best work she'd ever done, and when she was finished and standing in the front room, watching the family arrange themselves around a table she had built, she felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt since Virgil Moss was alive. She had a place to be. She thought, sometimes, about Arthur Cade, about who he was, whether he'd survived that winter of 1888, whether he'd ever known that the evidence he'd preserved had outlasted the wrong it documented. She'd asked Thomas to make some inquiries. The trail was cold, 16 years cold, but eventually word came back. Arthur Cade had died in the winter of 1889 in a boarding house in Chattanooga. He was 31 years old. He had no family recorded. Willa had Virgil's hammer on the wall above her workbench. She put Arthur Cade's letter in a frame beside it. 2 tools, she thought. Different kinds. Both of them had done their work. The $7 was the best money she ever spent. Not because of what it bought, a rusted car, a broken lock, a drawer full of old paper, but because of what it required her to do next. Every step that followed that purchase. The long night with the chisel, the walk to Whitfield, the 6 months of work and patience, the November afternoon in the courthouse, each of those steps was a nail driven in the right direction. Virgil used to say that a structure holds not because of any single joint, but because every joint does its part. She thought about that, sometimes, looking around the shop she'd built for herself out of nothing, out of $7 and a hammer, and the willingness to take a thing nobody wanted and find out what was inside. What was inside turned out to be justice and purpose, and the beginning of a life that was entirely her own. We'll leave you with the same question that Pearl Haskins left in the air of that courthouse hallway. A question we've been thinking about ever since. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you chose to not leave something alone? When you stayed with a problem or a wrong or an abandoned thing that everyone else had walked past, and found that the staying changed everything? We'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story settled somewhere in you the way it settled in us, stay with us. We have more of them to tell.